Greetings. This is a lecture on strategic HR, forecasting, and measuring effectiveness. This material covers some of the substantive HR topics, although HR is primarily involved in strategy. Management has to partner with the HR department in order to be able to forecast what their needs are for the upcoming year or the upcoming quarter or the upcoming next few years. And, I mean, there's an interplay between the strategic planning that has to go on in HR and the managers who are doing the day-to-day work managing the employees. And so what's important here is that there's a good partnership and a good communication going both ways between the HR department and the managers. So we'll talk a little bit about general strategy, specifically about the impact that HR has on strategy. We'll talk about how to forecast, why forecasting is important and the role that management plays in that, and then we'll get into how do we measure whether or not our activities are effective. And then while HR needs to gather this information, this is something that the management team, the people who are managing the employees, they want to know. They want to know how effective they've been. They want to know whether or not the things that we've invested in are actually working, whether the training is working or the good performance feedback has been working. And so this lecture, while it covers a lot of substantive HR topics, is really about that partnership between the two so that they can work together to best utilize our human capital. So we'll move on to the first substantive slide, which is asking the question, what is strategic HRM? Strategic HR is basically how the HR department, or really any other department in the company, aligns their people issues with the strategy and the mission and direction of the company. And every department, whether they're marketing or finance or accounting or HR, all are responsible for working towards aligning their activities with the mission and the vision and the strategy of the companies. HR specifically has to make sure that they are focusing on all of the people issues in all the departments to make sure that these issues are in connection and in alignment with the direction that the company is going in. And we'll talk about how that actually looks in a bit. There's a couple of different approaches to strategic HR. There's some belief that there is a one-size-fits-all best practices approach, that there are certain things that work best for a company. And while this list of things that you see on this first slide look really good, self-managed teams, selective hiring, employment security, we have to also recognize that that doesn't work in all organizations. For example, comparatively high compensation contingent on org performance. Apple, of course, will pay comparatively high compensation. McDonald's does not. Does that mean that McDonald's is a poor employer, that they don't do a good job, that they're not maximizing the use of their HR to meet their advantage? What is McDonald's competitive advantage? It's the consistency of their products, whether or not you like McDonald's or Big Macs, but it's the consistency of their products at a reasonable price anywhere you go. So they compete not on innovation, not on quality, but they compete on price and consistency of delivery. So just because they can't pay high price doesn't mean that they're not a successful company achieving what it sets out to achieve based on its mission and its vision. Selective hiring, same idea. Do we need selective hiring for a fry cook at McDonald's or a clerk at Walmart, as opposed to a research scientist at Apple or IBM? Of course, given the mission and vision of IBM or Apple as compared to Walmart or McDonald's, selective hiring makes no sense. Now, there are a few of these items that I think are really important and I think are consistent and uniform across the board. For example, extensive training. Absolutely. any company that is engaged in using their employees for their competitive advantage, particularly even McDonald's or Walmart. I mean, if you want to compete based on low costs, you've got to train your employees how to minimize those costs, so that you can sell things at a lower price to the end user. So extensive training makes sense no matter what your company strategy is. Sharing of financials and performance information. Employees are not stupid. Employees understand numbers if given to them in a way that is accessible. So, and I've got some, multitudes of examples of working with small businesses and companies that said, we share our numbers with our employees. They understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and therefore we find that we have an improved buy-in to the bottom line of the company. So if we can share our financials, if the people know how well the company is doing, there's less argument about, lack of transparency and top management hiding things. I mean, we're clear where the money is going, and we know how well we're doing, and we know how much harder we need to work in order to achieve our goals. So you could probably go through this whole list and figure out some of these things that work and make sense, and some of these things that don't make sense in a uniform way. And certainly, not every company and not every position, it doesn't make sense to have a self-managed team, or decentralized decision making, those sorts of things. So the point that I'm making here is this best practices approach can be debunked pretty quickly and pretty easily, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to HR. Strategic HR really relies upon the it depends approach. Our best practices are contingent upon the company's strategy, the culture within that company, and then all sorts of constraints that are out there we need to be aware of as we scan our environment. We need to be aware of geographic issues and how they differ from place to place, and also geographic culture, in the South versus the Midwest versus the coasts. We need to know what sort of availability there is in terms of skills and abilities in the labor force, what's going on in the economy, what kind of regulations are out there that we face. And all of these are important factors that we need to stay on top of to ensure that we're adapting our HR strategy to continue to meet the company strategy, and we have to take all these things into account. So you can see how managing people, not only are you managing a resource that has its own mind and was going to do what it wants to do in many respects if left to its own devices, you also have to manage them within the context of all these different constraints and contingencies, and you can see how managing people is probably one of the messiest things you will do in your life. So in this slide, we're going to compare and contrast traditional HR versus strategic HR. You get a good sense of how strategic HR has changed over time. Traditionally, the HR function had a very narrow skill application, very micro approach to things. They were focused on short-term, low-risk planning. They mostly focused on head counts and costs and things like that. What we're seeing much more now in the HR department is a more strategic perspective, that we see employees as contributors to the bottom line of the company, that they certainly can give us a competitive advantage as we are working. We have a much more long-term approach to things, much more adaptive and innovative practices that we're engaged in, and it's really essential that the HR department in managing people have a good sense of business acumen, and they understand change management and development of the organization and the employees within it. So, our focus much more so now in the HR arena is more on the strategic side of things. So strategic management, obviously we are focusing on understanding what is the mission and the vision and the direction that the company is going in. In essence, organization strategy is, what we want to do and how we want to do it. So our mission is, in a very broad sense, how we define ourselves. The goals are what the organization wants to achieve, and the strategic plan is, how it's going to achieve those goals.
The link below is from Southwest Airlines, and on the PowerPoint slide you can click on that hot link in play mode and go to their website where they talk about their mission and vision.
So every company comes up with a mission, goal, and strategic plan for themselves, and then that filters down through the organization.
So strategic planning has to filter down from the top, where the top management team has decided what the mission and vision and things are supposed to look like, and then it filters all the way down to the basic functions in each department, in each division. So how does this basically work? Well, we start at the corporate level, and at that corporate level, the organization has to decide the portfolio of businesses that it wants to be in. Sometimes they like to have a very consistent portfolio where things are all within the same industry, within their level of corporate competence, and then other corporations like to diversify their portfolio. So they have some parts of their business that, for example, the old Philip Morris, which is now Altria. Before they became Altria, they were known as Philip Morris, and Philip Morris was broken down into their Kraft General Foods division, which dealt with food and Oscar Mayer bologna and hot dogs, and the other division was cigarettes. So even within the cigarettes, they had a domestic market and they had an international market, so they had a very diversified portfolio. In the slideshow, if you click on the Cisco Systems link in the slideshow that's on it's in Blackboard, you can go to the website where Cisco talks about the way that they grow. They grow very consistent to their core mission, which is about connectivity and switches and ways to network people together. And they are unique in that they acquire businesses in order to grow. They typically don't get involved in too much R&D and develop from within. Cisco acquires through external growth, and they acquire other businesses. And you can see on their website, if you go click on that, you'll see an enormous number of acquisitions that they make annually, and this goes back for decades. It's part of their core uniqueness, their core strategy. They grow by acquisition. On the next slide, you'll see Boeing. I won't get into talking about Boeing, but the slide is a really good illustration of a company that has two different divisions that are also fairly similar, but they're structured in a very different way from Cisco, because Boeing grows internally. They don't grow by acquisition. So we'll move on to the next thing, the business level strategy or the divisional strategy. It's how then we would, for example, look at Cisco. And for Cisco, they have all those different acquisitions, and each of these acquisition groups have their own business level or division level strategy, and it's going to be a little bit different than the one next to them or the one to the right of them, but all of those businesses that they acquire all have to work towards the overall corporate level strategy, whatever it is. Each one plays their own role, each one has their own set of goals that they're trying to set based on the frame of reference that they're working within, what their core competencies are, but each of those divisions has their own way of doing it, but it all has to work towards the corporate level strategy. I mean, if you go back to Altria or to what was Philip Morris, used to be Philip Morris, again, Kraft General Foods and Oscar Mayer hot dogs was a very different strategy than the cigarette division, and even the international cigarette division is very different than the domestic division. So those are all unique business level or division level strategies. From there, we go down to the functional level strategy, which is at the department level. Each department in the company within those business divisions are all responsible for making sure that the overall mission and vision and goals of the company are communicated to the employees at the grassroots level, what they have to do, when they have to do it, and why they have to do it. So they have to be in alignment. So again, if you think about it this way, if HR's job is to hire people and to pay people well and to give them performance appraisals and reward systems, then if our company is got a strategy where we're growing in leaps and bounds, then of course we're going to use very different HR tactics than we would if we're a company that's struggling financially and we're actually thinking about doing layoffs. So it'll vary in that way. So each division, each department within those divisions, each department, marketing department, accounting, operations, they all have their own unique strategies, but they have to be in alignment with what the overall goal is for the company. And if those things aren't in alignment, then the company is going to be flailing. They're not going to be all heading in the right direction, and we want the company to all head in the right direction.